The crystal-white tablecloths of Westmont Grill glowed under the midday sunlight pouring through its tall windows. Forks clinked, glasses shimmered like cut diamonds, and the gentle hum of business lunches created a polished, almost theatrical calm. It was the kind of upscale American restaurant where money sat comfortably pressed suits, leather briefcases, and people who didn't check price tags because they never had to. Margaret Hale had worked here long enough to master the subtle art of being both present and invisible. At 62, she still tied her burgundy apron with care, smoothing the edges the same way she once tucked her children's shirts before school. Her joints ached more these days, but she kept her smile warm, gentle, practiced, unassuming. She was used to guests overlooking her, sometimes even coworkers did. But Margaret had learned long ago that kindness worked best when unnoticed. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. She carried a tray of water glasses past the center aisle, hearing the familiar laughter of the corner suits. A group of corporate regulars who treated the place like their second office. They laughed loudly, expansively, the way people do when they've never had to worry about public embarrassment or broken bones. Margaret tried to stay clear of their noise. It was easier that way. Then a sharp gasp cut through the room. An older woman, gray hair neatly brushed, coat elegantly tailored, had stumbled near the aisle and collapsed onto the polished wooden floor. Her purse slid several feet away, contents spilling like a burst bubble of private memories. For a fleeting second, no one moved. The suits at the nearest table stared, and then one of them burst out laughing. Another nudged his colleague, smirking. A few diners looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Margaret didn't hesitate. She set the tray down and knelt beside the woman, her knees protesting against the hard floor. "Easy now, ma'am. Let me help you. Are you hurt anywhere?" Her voice was low, steady, the same tone she once used on her own mother during difficult nights. The woman winced, bracing herself on Margaret's arm. I'm all right, dear. Just lost my balance." Margaret supported her carefully, checking her breathing, her posture. She brushed off the dust on the woman's coat with gentle precision. Around them, whispers grew. "Why is she making such a scene? She should just call the manager. She's overreacting." Someone at the laughing table muttered, loud enough for half the room to hear, "Guess she wants attention. Both of them." Margaret ignored it. She retrieved the woman's purse, gathering the items with deliberate care, and paused when she noticed a polished metal emblem attached inside the lining. A crest she had seen once on a charity brochure left in the break room. She couldn't quite place it, but something about it felt significant. "Let's get you seated," Margaret murmured, offering her arm again. But before she could help the woman up, a shadow fell across both of them. One of the suited men, the one whose laugh had cut through the room, stood abruptly, his expression shifting from amusement to something far more serious. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched. He stepped forward. "Mother?" he whispered. The room froze. Forks halted midair. Conversations died mid-sentence. Margaret looked up, startled, still holding the elderly woman steady. And the suits, the staff, the watching diners, all of them realized at the same time exactly who she had helped. The fallen woman wasn't just any guest. She was his mother. And he wasn't just another man in a suit. He was the billionaire who practically owned half the skyline visible through the restaurant windows. Margaret's world shifted in a heartbeat, though she didn't yet know how completely everything was about to change. The restaurant's polished atmosphere reasserted itself as the billionaire stepped closer, yet the tension lingering in the air began tightening like an invisible thread no one dared acknowledge. Westmont Grill, usually a haven of effortless refinement, felt strangely brittle as waiters exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to rush forward or quietly retreat behind their pristine service stations. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows and scattered across the marble floor in patterns that should have felt warm and inviting, yet somehow looked stark and interrogative against the moment unfolding. Customers shifted in their seats, torn between curiosity and discomfort, but none of them made a single move to help the trembling older woman struggling to stand. Margaret steadied the woman with careful hands, feeling the subtle quiver in the frail shoulders that reminded her painfully of the years spent caring for her own mother before illness consumed everything. Her instincts told her to keep her focus on the woman's breathing and posture, despite the cold awareness settling across her spine as the suited man approached with an expression that carried more gravity than any of the mocking laughter he had shown before. She sensed immediately that something immense was about to ripple outward, though she didn't yet understand how completely this encounter could overturn the delicate balance of her quiet, overlooked existence. The billionaire's polished shoes clicked sharply against the floor, a sound that echoed louder than the restaurant's earlier laughter as he crouched beside his mother, brushing a strand of silver hair from her cheek with a trembling hand that betrayed far more emotion than his carefully curated demeanor suggested. Margaret watched the transformation with a mixture of confusion and unexpected empathy, understanding suddenly that beneath the expensive suit and commanding presence stood a son confronted with a fear he had not anticipated during what should have been an ordinary business lunch. His voice dropped, softer now, cracking slightly as he asked his mother whether she felt pain in her hip or chest. And the vulnerability in that simple question stunned the room more effectively than his wealth ever had. The suits at the nearby table, once amused by the elderly woman's fall, now stared with wide eyes and stiffened backs, realizing the gravity of their earlier reactions and the consequences that might follow such careless disregard. A few waiters retreated behind the bar, whispering anxiously among themselves, while the manager emerged from the back with a strained smile that faltered the moment he recognized the elderly woman's identity. Margaret remained on the floor beside mother and son, her breathing steady, yet her thoughts racing as she tried to reconcile the absurd contrast between the kindness she had shown instinctively and the magnitude of the situation she had stumbled into. The older woman grasped Margaret's hand with surprising strength, revealing a quiet gratitude in her eyes that cut through Margaret's bewilderment and anchored her in the midst of the growing storm. She murmured a reassurance that she was merely shaken, not seriously injured, but her son's worry didn't fade entirely, and his gaze flicked repeatedly toward Margaret, as if trying to understand how a waitress had stepped in, when an entire room full of privileged onlookers chose mockery over compassion. The strangeness of the moment pressed heavily on Margaret's chest, yet she refused to release the woman's hand, knowing instinctively that her presence offered a steadiness no one else had bothered to provide. The billionaire straightened slowly, adjusting his suit jacket as he scanned the room with a measured expression that carried both disappointment and a restrained fury simmering just beneath the surface. The diners who had laughed at the woman's fall now averted their eyes, pretending to study their menus or sip their drinks, but nothing could erase the echo of their earlier amusement at her misfortune. Margaret could feel the shift in the room, as awareness spread. What had once seemed an insignificant stumble had suddenly become a reckoning for everyone who chose apathy over empathy. As the billionaire offered his arm to his mother, Margaret rose beside them, brushing off her apron and trying to compose herself, even as uncertainty churned inside her with relentless persistence. She sensed that something unspoken hung in the air between her and the powerful man now staring at her with a mixture of scrutiny and respect, though she had no idea what meaning he might assign to her small act of human decency. The older woman squeezed Margaret's hand one last time before releasing it reluctantly, her eyes shimmering with a gratitude that resonated more deeply than words could express. The manager rushed forward with nervous apologies and frantic explanations, insisting that staff training included protocols for assisting injured guests, though the insincerity in his tone was impossible to ignore. The billionaire offered no immediate response, simply raising a hand to wordlessly silence the manager as he continued studying Margaret with a contemplative intensity that made her shift her weight uncomfortably. She wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention, especially under the gaze of someone whose influence could destabilize or repair lives with a single decision. The older woman touched her son's sleeve softly, reminding him with a quiet gesture that kindness still existed even in rooms where cruelty felt easier, and Margaret watched the exchange with a subtle ache in her chest. She realized then that this moment, born from a simple choice to help someone in need, was unraveling into something far larger than she could have ever predicted. The polished world of wealth and power intersected abruptly with her quiet life of service and humility, creating a collision neither side had expected, yet none could dismiss. And in the silence that settled over Westmont Grill, Margaret sensed that this was only the beginning. Margaret steadied herself as the billionaire guided his mother toward a nearby table. Yet her hands continued trembling slightly from the intensity of the moment that had unfolded so quickly and so unexpectedly. She retrieved the older woman's fallen purse with deliberate care, fully aware that every eye in the restaurant seemed fixed on her movements, though she forced herself to focus only on ensuring the woman's belongings were neatly gathered and respectfully returned. As she knelt to collect a few scattered items, a small embossed card slipped halfway out of the purse's interior pocket, revealing an intricate silver crest. She recognized faintly from a charity brochure someone had left in the staff lounge months earlier. She remembered the symbol clearly because she had admired its craftsmanship while wondering what kind of family funded hospitals and shelters on such an enormous scale. The sight of that symbol now, in the aftermath of the woman's fall, struck her with quiet astonishment as she realized the emblem belonged to one of the most influential philanthropic foundations in the country, known for funding emergency care programs and community assistance initiatives she herself had once used. Her breath caught in her throat, not because she feared any consequences for having touched it, but because it became evident that the older woman's life intersected with far more power and generosity than anyone in the restaurant had understood moments earlier. She gently tucked the card back into the purse, treating it like something fragile and irreplaceable, then rose slowly with the purse held securely in both hands. The billionaire watched her intently from where he stood beside his mother, and Margaret felt his gaze follow her with an intensity that made the air seem heavier, as though he were trying to reconcile her quiet dignity with the indifference shown by nearly everyone else present. She approached them carefully, offering the purse back to the older woman with a soft, reassuring smile that conveyed concern rather than fear, even though her heart was still hammering with residual adrenaline. The woman accepted it gently, her fingers brushing Margaret's with a warmth that suggested gratitude deeper than words, and the simple touch steadied Margaret more effectively than any breath she had tried to take since the fall. The billionaire cleared his throat quietly, as though trying to dispel the heaviness surrounding the scene, and thanked Margaret in a voice threaded with sincerity that contrasted sharply with the smug confidence he had displayed earlier. Margaret nodded humbly, insisting she had only done what anyone should do, though she knew that wasn't true, because the memory of the room's laughter still echoed painfully in her mind. A few diners shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own guilt as they glanced between the billionaire, his mother, and the waitress who had responded with compassion none of them had shown. The manager attempted again to interject with explanations and assurances about guest safety protocols, but the billionaire dismissed him with a curt gesture that silenced the room more effectively than any raised voice could have achieved. Margaret's attention remained on the older woman, whose breathing had steadied though her expression still showed traces of shock, and she gently asked whether she might bring water or a warm towel to help her recover. The woman nodded with a small smile, clearly touched by Margaret's continued attentiveness, and the billionaire gave a subtle nod of approval, prompting Margaret to step away only after ensuring the woman felt secure in her seat. She moved toward the service station with measured steps, her mind still replaying the moment when the crest revealed itself, gnawing at her with implications she hadn't yet fully processed. As she filled a glass with chilled water and wrapped a cloth in gentle warmth, Margaret contemplated the strange intertwining of her world with theirs, recognizing that her simple act of kindness had quietly peeled back a layer of mystery surrounding a woman whose fall had seemed accidental, but whose identity carried far-reaching significance. She returned to the table with the items, offering them with the same quiet grace she had always practiced. But the billionaire's eyes followed her each time she moved, as though he were trying to understand why she had reacted with instinctive compassion while a room full of privileged individuals watched passively. Margaret dabbed the woman's forehead gently, noticing again the faint tremor in her hands that hinted at age rather than injury, and she adjusted the older woman's coat with a tenderness born from years of caring for those she loved. The billionaire softened visibly as he watched his mother respond to Margaret's gentleness, and his expression shifted from tension toward something contemplative, almost introspective, as though her kindness forced him to confront something uncomfortable within himself. Margaret sensed a shift, not just in him, but in the surrounding diners, who seemed to shrink under the silent rebuke, her actions now represented against their earlier indifference. She asked the older woman softly whether she would like her meal boxed to go, or if she preferred to rest before considering lunch again, and the woman chuckled lightly, assuring her she simply needed a moment to regain her balance. Margaret found herself smiling in return, relieved to see warmth returning to the woman's expression, though the emotional weight of the situation still lingered heavily around them. She stepped back respectfully, giving the billionaire space to sit beside his mother. Yet the woman reached out once more to squeeze Margaret's hand, that small gesture resonating deeply through her chest like a quiet affirmation of something meaningful. As Margaret withdrew, she sensed this encounter had ignited a spark she didn't fully understand yet, something tied not to money or fear or status, but to the profound human truth that compassion, even when offered quietly, has the power to reveal everything hidden beneath the surface. And although she didn't know how the billionaire would react once the shock faded, she felt the unshakable certainty that her small act had already begun unraveling a story larger than she could have imagined. The billionaire remained seated beside his mother for several quiet moments, yet Margaret could feel his attention shifting toward her with a growing intensity that made the air thicken as though the room itself had begun leaning in to listen. She tried to resume her tasks with practiced calm, placing menus on neighboring tables and refilling water glasses with steady hands, but her pulse betrayed her nerves each time she sensed his gaze following her movements with a curiosity neither hostile nor entirely benign. The diners who had earlier mocked her now kept their voices low, watching the subtle tension unfold with the uneasy fascination of people who sensed a balance of power shifting in real time. When Margaret approached to check on the older woman again, the billionaire rose slightly from his chair, his expression tightened by a mixture of protectiveness and something more probing that unsettled her deeply. He waited until she finished adjusting the woman's napkin before asking, in a voice far gentler than the one he had used with his colleagues earlier, whether she had medical training or experience caring for the elderly. The question landed with surprising weight, partly because it acknowledged her compassion in a way few customers ever bothered to notice, and partly because it hinted at an underlying suspicion she couldn't fully decipher. Margaret hesitated before answering, unsure whether he expected an explanation or simply wanted confirmation that she had acted responsibly while others stood idle. She finally replied that she had spent years caring for her mother during her illness and had learned to read subtle signs of discomfort long before anyone spoke of pain. The billionaire nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing not with doubt but with contemplation, as though he were sorting through the implications of her words and mapping them against his impressions of how quickly and naturally she had responded earlier. His scrutiny made her increasingly uneasy, yet she sensed no malice in it, only a determined effort to understand something that had unexpectedly unsettled his certainty about people. The older woman touched her son's wrist gently, urging him to sit, but he continued standing, asking another question with the same persistent gentleness that pressed deeper than she anticipated. He wondered aloud how long she had been working at the restaurant and whether she had always lived in the city, his tone polite, yet edged with a curiosity that felt strangely intimate, coming from someone whose world barely brushed against people like her. Margaret forced a small smile, explaining that she had lived nearby most of her life and had been working at Westmont Grill for several years to maintain stability after her children grew older and life grew quieter. Her answer seemed to intrigue him further, and he stepped a little closer, lowering his voice as if inviting a confidence rather than demanding information, asking whether she had ever considered working in caregiving or community outreach, given her evident skill and calm under pressure. His proximity unsettled her, not because he was intimidating, but because the sincerity in his eyes suggested he genuinely wanted to understand her choices rather than judge them, which was a rarity in a room where people usually looked past her as if she were part of the decor. Margaret steadied her breath, explaining that life had changed direction unexpectedly after her mother passed away, and she had simply taken the work that allowed her to remain grounded while putting her family first. The billionaire studied her expression with a depth that bordered on intrusive yet carried no unkindness, and she felt a warmth rising uncomfortably along her neck under the weight of his scrutiny. His mother watched them both with an amused fondness, as though she recognized something unfolding that neither of them had yet acknowledged, and the gentle sparkle in her eyes made Margaret's chest tighten with an odd mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. Margaret stepped back instinctively, attempting to reclaim the professional distance expected of her position, but the billionaire leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice again to ask if she had always been this composed when faced with emergencies. His question struck her unexpectedly hard, because she heard genuine admiration in it, a quiet respect that left her flustered despite her efforts to remain collected. She inhaled slowly, replying that she had learned long ago to stay calm for the sake of others, even when her own heart felt like it might break under the weight of uncertainty. The billionaire's expression softened at her words, and for a fleeting moment she felt an unspoken connection stretching between them, tenuous, fragile, yet undeniably real, born not from glamour or status, but from something profoundly human. He moved even closer, close enough that she could sense the subtle warmth of his presence and detect a faint hint of cedar in his cologne, and asked a quieter question, one that felt more personal than any he had asked before. He wanted to know why she had reacted so swiftly when the rest of the room hesitated, and whether kindness came naturally to her or whether it had been shaped by hardship and loss. The tenderness in his tone startled her, for it hinted at a vulnerability he rarely revealed, and she found herself searching his face for the hardened arrogance he had shown earlier, only to discover traces of someone far more complicated. Margaret swallowed lightly before answering, telling him that she believed people deserved dignity no matter their age, status, or circumstances, and that stepping forward simply felt like the right thing to do. The billionaire seemed moved by this, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that made the room's soft clatter fade into a distant hum, and the older woman smiled knowingly, as if witnessing the beginnings of a conversation that would outgrow the small corner of the restaurant where it began. Margaret felt her pulse quicken beneath his attention, unsure whether she should retreat or stand firm, but before she could decide, the billionaire thanked her again, quietly, sincerely, and with a depth that left her breathless, despite her efforts to remain collected. The moment felt suspended in time, stretching delicately between duty and something far more personal, and as Margaret stepped away to refill water pitchers, she sensed that the questions he asked were only the beginning of something larger than either of them yet understood. Margaret moved toward the service counter to reset her tray, yet the weight of the billionaire's lingering questions still pressed gently against her thoughts, leaving a faint tremor of unease she couldn't fully shake, despite her years of practiced composure. She tried to refocus on the rhythm of her duties, the clink of glassware, the soft sweep of linen napkins, the familiar hum of lunchtime chatter, yet something in the room felt subtly altered, as though the delicate balance between routine and disruption had shifted in ways she couldn't yet name. The billionaire had returned to his mother's side, but his posture remained taut with an alertness that suggested he was bracing for something neither casual nor predictable. The manager approached Margaret with a strained smile that pulled too tightly at the corners of his mouth, his fingers tapping nervously against the notepad he always carried when attempting to mask anxiety behind a facade of professionalism. He whispered that high-profile guests like the billionaire often attracted excessive attention and that she should exercise caution to avoid further incidents that could reflect poorly on the restaurant's reputation. though his warning sounded more like an attempt to shift blame than to offer genuine guidance. Margaret nodded politely, unwilling to challenge him, even though his tone carried an undercurrent of fear that belied his forced calm. As she stepped past the bar, she overheard two servers whispering in rapid, tense voices about an unexpected visit from district supervisors who supposedly kept close watch on restaurants favored by wealthy patrons with influence over municipal permits and development projects. Their hushed tones were laced with apprehension, and one of them mentioned that the billionaire's company was currently embroiled in a high-stakes negotiation involving property acquisitions that had stirred political tensions throughout the city. Margaret felt a chill crawl slowly up her spine as she realized the presence of such a figure in their dining room meant they were entangled in a much larger world where power moved quietly, yet forcefully beneath polished surfaces. She returned to the billionaire's table to offer fresh water, but before she could speak, a man in a dark, tailored suit stepped through the entrance with hawkish alertness, scanning the room with the precision of someone trained to detect threats before they emerged. His expression sharpened when he spotted the billionaire, and he strode quickly toward the table, leaning down to whisper something urgent that made the billionaire's jaw tense, and his hand curl slightly against the edge of the table. Margaret paused mid-step, sensing immediately that the newcomer's presence signaled a shift from personal vulnerability to a more tangible danger that reached beyond the intimate moment shared earlier. The older woman placed a calming hand on her son's arm, urging him to breathe, but his eyes had narrowed into a look that blended calculation, worry, and a hint of restrained anger. He stood slowly, thanking the newcomer with a curt nod before turning toward Margaret, his voice low and edged with something darker than curiosity, as he asked whether she had noticed anyone unusual, lingering near the entrance or observing their table since his mother's fall. Her heart stuttered, unsure how to answer, yet she admitted she had seen a few guests watching more intently than usual, though she hadn't sensed immediate danger in their attention. The man in the dark suit stepped closer, fixing her with a level gaze that carried neither hostility nor comfort, but rather the clinical intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating risks with ruthless accuracy. He asked whether she had touched anything besides the older woman's purse when helping her, and the question startled her with its precise sharpness, though she answered honestly that she had only gathered the woman's scattered belongings without disturbing anything else. The billionaire's expression softened slightly in relief, yet the tension in his shoulders remained, as though he were bracing for news he feared might confirm a suspicion he didn't want to articulate. Margaret sensed the atmosphere in the restaurant shifting subtly as several diners began noticing the newcomer's presence, their earlier indifference replaced by a quiet awareness that something far more serious than a simple fall had occurred. Whispers rippled softly across the room, and a few patrons glanced nervously between the billionaire and the suited man, sensing that some invisible line had been crossed from casual disruption into the realm of genuine concern. The manager approached again with a strained attempt at diplomacy, but the newcomer dismissed him politely before turning back to the billionaire to continue their low-voiced exchange. Margaret's pulse quickened as she noticed the older woman gripping her son's sleeve with trembling fingers, her voice barely audible as she insisted she felt fine and didn't want to cause trouble. Her son reassured her gently, though his gaze remained locked on the shadows near the doorway, scanning for something Margaret couldn't perceive but instinctively understood to be tied to the crest she had glimpsed inside the purse. She realized suddenly that the woman's fall might not have been a simple accident, and that her instinctive act of kindness had inadvertently drawn her into a web of complications that stretched well beyond the restaurant's gleaming walls. The billionaire exhaled slowly, turning toward Margaret with a look that held gratitude intertwined with a gravity that made her chest tighten in quiet apprehension. He told her that his mother rarely traveled without security, and that her brief unaccompanied moment near the entrance had concerned him for reasons he couldn't fully explain in public, especially with eyes and ears scattered throughout the room. Margaret swallowed hard, understanding then that the threat pressing against the billionaire's family was far more complex than any of the diners silently watching them could comprehend. Standing there between the polished tables and the weight of his unspoken worry, she felt the first true stirrings of danger brushing against the edges of her quiet life, awakening an awareness she had not expected when she first knelt to help the woman moments earlier. The world she had stepped into, however unintentionally, was shifting beneath her feet, and she sensed that whatever came next would carry consequences far beyond her small act of compassion. Margaret attempted to retreat from the table, to give the family privacy, yet the subtle tremor in the billionaire's voice lingered in her mind like an echo she couldn't easily shake as she resumed her duties with deliberate, measured steps. The quiet hum of the restaurant was returning, but it carried an edge now, a brittle tension woven through the whispers of diners who sensed danger without understanding its source. She placed silverware on a newly seated table, her hands steady out of habit rather than calm, while her thoughts circled the unsettling conversation she had overheard between the billionaire and the man in the dark suit. The sense of unease that hovered around their table felt heavier with each passing second, as if the room itself was bracing for something unpleasant to erupt. The laughter from the corner suits resumed, though it carried a forced, brittle tone, as if they hoped their mockery might blot out the embarrassment of having jeered at a woman who clearly held far more significance than they realized. One of them leaned back in his chair with exaggerated confidence, glancing toward Margaret with a smirk that curled unpleasantly at the edges, suggesting he wanted to reassert dominance over a moment he had lost control of earlier. He nudged his colleague and muttered something under his breath, prompting a snicker that reached Margaret's ears with uncomfortable clarity, though she couldn't quite catch every word of the whispered insult. As she approached to refill their water glasses, the smirking man tilted his head, giving her a slow, condescending once-over, before remarking, in a voice just loud enough to carry across the table, that some waitresses knew how to make a spectacle of themselves when wealthy eyes were watching. His companions chuckled, quietly, their laughter tinged with the resentment of men who disliked having their cruelty exposed in public. Margaret swallowed the sharp sting of humiliation tightening in her chest, yet managed to keep her voice calm as she placed the pitcher on the table, refusing to allow their pettiness to provoke an unprofessional response. Another man leaned forward, swirling the ice in his glass, and suggested that over-eager staff sometimes pretended to care about customers to gain favor with influential patrons. His words floated across the table like thinly veiled poison, coated in a veneer of polite diction that barely concealed the malice underneath. Margaret felt her cheeks warm with indignation, though she kept her posture composed, sensing that engaging would only fuel their need to feel superior after being publicly shamed by their earlier behavior. The men seemed emboldened by her silence, mistaking restraint for weakness rather than dignity. Nearby diners began glancing uncomfortably between the corner suits and the billionaire's table, clearly sensing the direction of the men's insinuations. The billionaire himself looked up sharply when he heard the raised voices, his gaze narrowing with immediate suspicion as he assessed the situation. Margaret sensed the shift instantly, though she continued her task with steady hands, refusing to allow the men's words to rattle her visibly. Her silence seemed to irritate them even more, and one muttered that she was probably hoping for a tip large enough to fix her whole life. A comment that landed with enough venom to make several nearby patrons stiffen in discomfort. As Margaret turned to leave their table, the suited man who had first laughed at the older woman's fall extended his foot slightly, as if attempting to trip her while pretending to adjust his position. She caught the subtle movement just in time, sidestepping it with fluid precision that surprised even her, though the flash of anger that crossed his face told her she had undermined his petty attempt to regain control. The crude gesture sparked a quiet murmur among nearby diners, and even a few servers shot the man disapproving glances, recognizing the cruelty in his attempt to embarrass someone who had done nothing but help. The man's smirk faltered momentarily before he leaned back again, calling after her in a falsely sympathetic tone that barely masked his contempt, asking whether she planned to check on the billionaire's mother again or if she was simply auditioning for a different kind of attention. His companions laughed at the implication, though the laughter died abruptly when the billionaire stood with a deliberate, controlled movement that seemed to reverberate across the room. Margaret halted mid-step, feeling her heart thrum as she braced for the inevitable confrontation, though she wished fervently that she could disappear into the background before becoming the center of yet another public moment. The billionaire approached slowly, each step measured and precise, his expression composed but edged with a cold fury that seemed to drain the room of ambient noise. He stopped between Margaret and the corner suits, his jaw clenched, and asked in a voice so calm, it was almost terrifying, whether they had enjoyed mocking his mother earlier or if belittling hard-working strangers brought them some other perverse satisfaction. The suits stiffened, exchanging uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for a direct confrontation from the very man whose respect they had once desperately craved. Margaret felt heat rise in her face as she tried to step back, but the billionaire gently lifted a hand, silently signaling her to remain where she was. He glanced at her briefly, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, with a silent acknowledgment of the humiliation she had endured because of men who mistook cruelty for wit. Then he turned back toward the suits, his composure hardening again as he demanded an explanation for their behavior and asked whether they considered harassment an appropriate pastime during business lunches. The men scrambled for excuses, stammering apologies laced with self-serving justifications, though their voices shook with an unmistakable fear that shattered whatever arrogance they had wielded earlier. Margaret watched silently, uncertain whether to feel vindicated or overwhelmed, though the flicker of protectiveness in the billionaire's expression made her chest tighten in ways she could not easily name. She took a slow breath, steadying herself against the rising tide of emotion, and in that moment realized that the mocking voices were no longer the dominant force in the room. Something else had replaced them, an unspoken shift in loyalty, attention, and power centered unexpectedly around her. The tension lingering in the room gradually settled into a stunned silence, yet Margaret sensed an undercurrent of unease swirling beneath the surface as she stood motionless beside the table, unsure whether she should retreat or remain present, while the billionaire confronted the men who had demeaned her. His voice remained measured and controlled, but the quiet edge in his tone made it unmistakably clear that he would not tolerate any further disrespect directed toward his mother or the woman who had been the only person to help her when she fell. Margaret felt heat gather behind her ribs, a complex blend of embarrassment, gratitude, and an unfamiliar fluttering anxiety that made her wish she could slip away unnoticed before the moment grew any more complicated than it already was. When the billionaire finally stepped back from the suits, dismissing their nervous excuses with a curt nod that ended the confrontation, he turned toward Margaret with a softening in his eyes that unsettled her even more than his earlier fury. He motioned gently for her to follow him, and though she hesitated for a heartbeat, her instincts urged her to check once more on his mother, whose fragile frame seemed smaller now that the adrenaline of the commotion had worn away. She approached the older woman with quiet steps, mindful of her posture and breathing, and asked if she was feeling any dizziness or discomfort after the emotional strain of the past few minutes. The older woman gave her a weary smile, the kind that carried both exhaustion and gratitude, and she reached for Margaret's hand with a tenderness that pierced straight through the wall of professional distance Margaret tried so hard to maintain. As their fingers touched, Margaret felt the faint tremor in the woman's hand, a gentle vibration that spoke to age rather than weakness. Yet something in the gesture felt almost symbolic, as if she were entrusting her with a truth she couldn't yet articulate. Margaret knelt beside her to ensure she felt steady, adjusting the soft wool coat that had slipped from her shoulders during the earlier commotion. As she did, her gaze briefly caught on a small pendant tucked beneath the woman's collar, an intricate silver piece engraved with the same crest Margaret had seen inside the purse earlier, though here it gleamed with a richer luster that suggested old craftsmanship and personal significance. The pendant swayed lightly as the woman shifted, and Margaret felt a subtle chill run through her as she realized it wasn't merely decorative but symbolic of something deeper, perhaps a legacy or connection far older than the philanthropic materials she had once glimpsed in passing. She tried to look away discreetly, not wanting to intrude on anything personal, but the older woman noticed her brief pause and offered a knowing smile that carried the faintest sparkle of mischief. "You recognize it, don't you?" the woman whispered, her voice soft but steady, as though testing whether Margaret would acknowledge her observation honestly. Margaret swallowed hard, uncertain how to answer without stepping beyond her role. Yet honesty felt like the only path she could take. She admitted she had seen the emblem before, though only in brochures about charitable foundations and community programs that had once helped her during a difficult chapter of her life. The older woman's eyes warmed with a depth of understanding that made Margaret's throat tighten unexpectedly, and she squeezed Margaret's hand a little harder, as if confirming something she had silently suspected. The billionaire returned to his mother's side just in time to witness the exchange, and the subtle shift in his expression told Margaret that he too sensed the significance of the pendant's reveal, though he seemed more focused on the connection forming between the two women. He crouched beside them, his gaze flicking from his mother's gentle smile to Margaret's humbled expression, and asked quietly whether everything was all right or if his mother needed medical attention. The older woman shook her head with a soft huff, insisting she simply needed a moment of rest and perhaps a cup of warm tea to settle her nerves. Margaret promised to bring the tea immediately, but as she stood to leave, the older woman caught her wrist lightly and whispered that she reminded her of someone she once knew, someone kind, patient, and unafraid to step into uncomfortable spaces when compassion demanded it. The words washed over Margaret with a warmth that startled her, for she hadn't been compared to anyone meaningful in years, not since her mother's passing had left her anchored in a quiet, solitary world that seldom offered gentle affirmations. The billionaire watched the interaction closely, his expression softening into something contemplative, as though seeing his mother's reaction unlocked a dimension of Margaret he hadn't previously understood. As Margaret stepped away to prepare the tea, she felt the weight of the pendant's image linger in her thoughts. Pulling at her curiosity with a quiet insistence she couldn't ignore despite her reluctance to pry into matters that didn't concern her. She moved behind the counter with deliberate steps, her mind swirling with questions she had no right to ask, yet the faint tremble of the older woman's fingers and the warmth of her whispered praise clung to her like a delicate thread connecting their two worlds unexpectedly. She measured tea leaves with practiced precision, trying to steady her breath, but her hands betrayed her internal turmoil with a subtle shake each time she recalled the silver pendant swaying gently over the woman's heart. When Margaret returned with the tea, she placed the cup before the older woman with a tenderness that mirrored the compassion she had shown moments after the fall. The older woman thanked her, then touched the pendant subtly, almost as if offering a silent invitation for Margaret to understand its significance without asking directly. The gesture struck Margaret as intimate and deliberate, as though the pendant itself served as a symbolic bridge between two lives separated by class, yet connected unexpectedly through shared moments of humanity. The billionaire watched the exchange quietly, his gaze flickering with questions he hadn't yet voiced but would almost certainly ask soon. And as Margaret stepped back to allow the family space once more, she sensed that her accidental glimpse of the pendant had revealed far more than a simple emblem it had exposed, a hidden thread of history, wealth, and vulnerability that tied this family together, and had now, for reasons she didn't yet comprehend, drawn her into its quiet orbit. Margaret stepped back from the table with a steadying breath, hoping the soothing warmth of the tea might calm not only the older woman's nerves, but also the storm quietly gathering behind the billionaire's eyes. She moved toward the next station to retrieve fresh napkins, yet her mind remained stubbornly tethered to the image of the pendant glinting beneath the woman's collar, its intricate crest stirring questions she wasn't sure she had any right to wonder about. The clatter of dishes and hushed conversations faded into a distant blur as she tried to refocus on her duties, though her pulse continued to flutter with uneasy energy born from the strange intimacy of the moment she had just shared. As she approached the family's table again, the billionaire straightened with a controlled breath, watching her with an intensity that suggested he had been waiting for the right moment to speak privately. His mother's gentle expression indicated a clear desire to shield Margaret from whatever scrutiny or discomfort might follow, yet there was a visible determination in the billionaire's posture that signaled he had no plans to let the moment pass without answers. Margaret felt a faint tremor ripple through her as he stepped forward, lowering his voice enough to ensure the conversation remained between them while the surrounding diners continued nursing their curiosity from a polite distance. "Where did you see that emblem before?" he asked softly, his tone calm but threaded with an unmistakable urgency that made Margaret's breath catch despite her attempts at composure. His question pierced directly through the fragile barrier she had built between herself and the quietly expanding mystery looming around his family, and she found herself frozen for a moment, unsure whether explaining the truth would alleviate his concern or entangle her further in matters that exceeded her understanding. She hesitated, searching his expression for any hint of accusation, yet all she found was a tightly restrained blend of worry and determination that made refusing to answer feel impossible. She finally admitted that she had once seen the crest on a brochure for a charitable foundation known for supporting community medical services and emergency response programs, though she emphasized she hadn't thought much of it beyond admiring the artistry of the symbol. The billionaire's eyes narrowed in thought, absorbing her words with a deliberateness that made her heart pound uneasily, as though he were evaluating whether the information revealed something he needed to fear or something he could finally trust. His mother lifted her cup delicately, watching the exchange with an expression that carried not surprise, but a quiet, knowing sorrow, as if the truth behind the emblem carried weight far heavier than either of them had expressed. Before Margaret could step back, the billionaire leaned closer, lowering his voice further, as he asked whether she remembered exactly where she had seen the brochure or if she had noticed anyone else looking at the pendant when his mother fell. The question startled her with its pointed precision, as though he believed the fall had been observed or even triggered by someone with intent rather than accident. Margaret felt her breath falter as she tried to recall the scattering of glances around the room, yet the memory of the chaotic moment blurred with the adrenaline she had felt while kneeling beside the older woman. "I'm not sure," she confessed softly, hoping honesty would ground the growing intensity swirling around them. "I didn't see anyone suspicious, and I don't think anyone noticed the pendant except me." The billionaire studied her carefully, his gaze tightening for a moment before softening with reluctant acceptance, as though her sincerity confirmed a fear he had been struggling to suppress. His mother reached for his hand with quiet urgency, whispering that drawing attention would serve no one, especially not Margaret, who had been nothing but kind in the face of indifference. The billionaire exhaled slowly, rubbing his brow with a weary motion that hinted at days, perhaps weeks, of accumulated strain that no amount of wealth or authority could easily dispel. He murmured something to his mother that Margaret couldn't quite catch, but the words carried a resonance of caution, responsibility, and a brewing conflict that extended beyond the polished walls of the restaurant. The older woman touched his wrist again, her eyes soft with unspoken reassurance, and Margaret sensed that the pendant wasn't just a family emblem, but a protective symbol intertwined with legacy, secrecy, and perhaps even danger. When the billionaire straightened again, he glanced toward the entrance where the man in the dark tailored suit remained stationed with vigilant intensity, his gaze sweeping the room with the precision of someone accustomed to anticipating threats long before they materialized. The billionaire's expression hardened slightly as he looked back at Margaret, then softened with something resembling apology when he realized she was watching him with a mixture of confusion and concern. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm, as he asked whether she had told anyone, coworkers, friends, or family, about what she saw inside the purse. Margaret's stomach tightened at the implication, though she kept her voice steady as she assured him she had said nothing to anyone, nor had she intended to share details that weren't hers to expose. He nodded slowly, visibly relieved, though his posture remained tense, as if he were balancing gratitude against a fear he could not yet articulate. The older woman sipped her tea, then turned to Margaret with a gentle smile that warmed the space between them, her voice soft but deliberate as she said, "Sometimes a single moment reveals more truth than years of polite conversation." R.N. The billionaire's jaw tightened at his mother's words, and he stepped aside, giving Margaret space yet watching her, with a lingering intensity that suggested her answer had triggered the very realization he had been anxious to confirm. His silence carried weight, drawing Margaret into the gravity of his family's unspoken conflict, and she sensed deeply that the fall had been far more than clumsiness or accident. It had been a catalyst, a small opening through which truth was beginning to pour. As Margaret stepped back to allow them privacy, she felt an invisible shift ripple through the room, marking the moment the story changed direction, not because she had sought involvement, but because her kindness had illuminated something others had tried to hide. Margaret stepped away from the table with a polite nod, yet the billionaire's unwavering gaze followed her retreating figure, with a mixture of scrutiny and conflicted gratitude that made the air thicken around him like an invisible storm gathering strength. He remained standing beside his mother, but his posture carried a tension far deeper than simple concern, revealing a man grappling with truths he had tried to shield from public view for far longer than anyone in the restaurant could imagine. His mother's gentle touch on his sleeve seemed to steady him only slightly, though Margaret could still sense the weight of emotions he was struggling to contain: fear, frustration, protectiveness, and a simmering anger that felt less directed at her and more at the circumstances threatening to swallow them all. The man in the dark suit approached quietly, leaning close to the billionaire's ear to deliver a brief but urgent whisper that caused his expression to harden with grim resolve. The shift was subtle, yet unmistakable, like the tightening of a rope pulled quietly but forcefully by unseen hands. Margaret watched from across the room as he dismissed the man with a nod, then ran a hand over his face in a weary motion that betrayed the strain of someone accustomed to managing crises behind closed doors rather than beneath the scrutiny of curious strangers in a crowded dining room. His mother adjusted her coat with delicate fingers, her gaze steady and thoughtful as she looked up at her son with the kind of quiet understanding only a parent could hold, especially one who had witnessed the burdens he carried long before he became a figure of immense influence. She whispered something that made his shoulders sag for a moment, as though her words temporarily pierced through the armor he wore so carefully. He crouched beside her again, clasping her hand with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the authority he exuded minutes earlier when confronting the men who mocked them. Margaret, though distant enough to avoid intruding, noticed the way his jaw tightened and his eyes flickered with a blend of regret and determination, as if his mother's fall had confirmed a suspicion he desperately hoped was wrong. She could sense the complicated emotions swirling beneath the surface, a man torn between protecting someone he loved deeply and confronting the truth that no amount of wealth could insulate him from life's most painful vulnerabilities. The realization seemed to shake him more profoundly than any business setback or corporate betrayal, revealing a softness he had concealed beneath layers of polished confidence. When he finally stood, he scanned the room with a sharp, assessing gaze that softened only when it drifted toward Margaret, though he quickly looked away as if embarrassed by the instinct to seek reassurance from someone so far removed from his world. He inhaled deeply, smoothing the front of his suit jacket before speaking in a low, steady voice that hummed with gravity, telling his mother he needed a moment to address something essential before they left the restaurant. His mother squeezed his hand again, offering a gentle nod that conveyed understanding rather than resistance, as if she trusted him completely despite the storm brewing behind his eyes. He crossed the room slowly, his steps deliberate, heading toward the entrance where the dark-suited man stood waiting with a grim set to his features. Their voices remained low, but Margaret could read the tension in their gestures, the taut shoulders, the brief hand movements, the occasional glances toward the windows, as if expecting someone unwelcome to appear at any moment. Though she strained to keep her focus on her work, her ears caught fragments of their exchange, mentions of missed calls, unexpected movements, and suspicions that someone might have been watching the older woman for weeks. Margaret's breath grew shallow as she realized the fall might not have been a harmless accident, and she felt a chill crawl slowly up her spine, tracing the outline of her growing fear that she had stepped into a conflict far beyond her comprehension. The billionaire turned suddenly, catching her watching from across the room, and though she attempted to look away politely, his gaze held her for a moment longer than expected, revealing a wordless plea for patience, trust, or perhaps forgiveness he hadn't yet earned. He walked back toward her with a slow, purposeful stride, each step heavy with the weight of unspoken truth. When he stopped before her, his eyes carried a raw vulnerability she had not seen earlier, as though the facade he presented to the world had cracked ever so slightly under the pressure of the moment. He thanked her again for helping his mother, but this time his voice carried a quiet note of emotion that made Margaret's heart tighten in sympathetic ache. He admitted that the past few months had been chaotic for their family due to matters he couldn't fully disclose, yet he wanted her to understand that her kindness had meant far more than a simple act of courtesy in a moment of crisis. His mother called to him softly, and he turned, but not before offering Margaret a look laden with meaning, respect mingled with fear, gratitude intertwined with guilt, and something unspoken shimmering beneath the surface, fragile yet unmistakably human. It was a look that told her he had seen her clearly in a way few had bothered to before, recognizing not just her composure and skill but the quiet courage that set her apart from those who mocked or ignored the woman who needed help. He knelt beside his mother again, whispering something she answered with a soft laugh that carried warmth even through the tension. Margaret watched the exchange from a discreet distance, realizing that whatever hidden truths were weighing on the family were beginning to surface, and the billionaire was no longer able to shield himself from the consequences of those truths. The vulnerability on his face made her chest tighten with an unexpected rush of empathy, stirring a realization that the man who commanded entire corporations now stood as nothing more than a worried son, terrified of losing the person he loved most. In that moment, the billionaire appeared smaller, not in stature, but in the rawness of his emotions, stripped of status, stripped of power, and reduced to something quietly human that mirrored the same ache Margaret carried in her own memories of loss and love. And as she watched him gently lift his mother's hand to his lips, she understood that the real threat he faced was not only external but deeply personal, unraveling the fragile sense of control he clung to with trembling hands. The restaurant settled into an uneasy stillness as the billionaire remained kneeling beside his mother, yet Margaret sensed that the silence held a fragile edge, as though the truth waiting to surface had begun pressing against the air itself, demanding to be acknowledged. She stood near the service counter, uncertain whether she should approach again or give the family space. But the older woman's soft voice drifted across the room with surprising clarity, drawing every pair of eyes toward her as she patted her son's hand with a gentle but firm insistence. Her words carried the calm authority of someone who had lived long enough to know when pretenses needed to end and when truths, no matter how heavy, had to be spoken aloud. "My dear," the older woman murmured, her gaze steady and unflinching, "you cannot keep hiding from what is already happening." The billionaire stiffened, his shoulders rising instinctively as though bracing against a blow, yet he did not pull away from her touch. Margaret watched with quiet apprehension, sensing that whatever conversation was unfolding now was about to shift the entire atmosphere of the restaurant, altering not only how others saw the family, but how Margaret herself understood the strange gravity that had drawn her into their world. The older woman pressed her palm lightly to her chest, drawing attention to the pendant that had been partially concealed beneath her collar until now. She let it rest against the outside of her coat, allowing the silver emblem to catch the light and shimmer with deliberate clarity. Gasps rippled quietly across the room as several diners recognized the crest, though none dared voice their realization aloud. The billionaire's jaw tightened as he murmured a quiet plea for his mother to keep things discreet, but she shook her head gently, her eyes filled with a resolve that made her appear far stronger than her frail frame suggested. "This young woman saw what others ignored," she said softly, turning her gaze toward Margaret with a warmth that made Margaret's breath hitch despite her efforts to remain composed. "She deserves to understand why her kindness mattered more than she realizes." Margaret's pulse quickened, and she took a small step forward, unsure whether she was being summoned or simply acknowledged, yet unable to look away as the older woman rested her fingers on the pendant with reverence that spoke of legacy, loss, and responsibility intertwined. The billionaire exhaled sharply, closing his eyes for a moment before rising slowly to his feet with a kind of controlled grace that only barely masked the turmoil tightening his expression. He faced the room briefly, his gaze sweeping across the curious diners, the anxious staff, and finally returning to Margaret with a mixture of resignation and guarded vulnerability. "My mother," he began, his voice steady but softened by the weight of the moment, "is the founder of the Whitmore Foundation, a philanthropic organization my family built to support emergency care and community services across the country." "Oh." A murmur passed through the restaurant, soft, reverent, and tinged with stunned recognition as several patrons straightened in their seats, clearly taken aback by the revelation. Margaret felt her chest constrict with a sudden rush of understanding, realizing that the pendant had not been merely decorative but a symbol of the Foundation's legacy, one she had unknowingly encountered during the most difficult chapter of her own life. The billionaire continued speaking with a quiet intensity that carried both pride and sorrow, explaining that his father had once devoted his life to expanding the Foundation's reach, but after his unexpected passing, the responsibility had fallen heavily on their family. His voice faltered slightly as he admitted that they had been navigating attempts by external parties to seize control of the Foundation's assets, using subtle tactics and hidden manipulations that had placed both him and his mother under constant pressure. Margaret felt her heart drop as she grasped the implication behind his earlier fear that the fall may not have been purely accidental but possibly triggered by someone watching for an opportunity to exploit the older woman's vulnerability. The billionaire confirmed her unspoken thought with a strained breath, confessing that they had noticed unusual activity around them for weeks, though no direct threats had yet surfaced. The older woman reached for Margaret's hand again, her grip steadier now, as if drawing strength from the presence of someone who had acted without hesitation when the room had chosen silence. "You were the only one who saw a person, not a symbol," she whispered, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "You acted with compassion, not curiosity or ambition." Margaret swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the weight of the woman's words, realizing that her simple act had pierced through layers of secrecy and caution with a sincerity wealth could never replicate. The billionaire's gaze softened as he watched the exchange, his earlier frustration melting into something gentler, almost reverent, as though seeing Margaret anew through the lens of his mother's gratitude. He stepped closer, his voice low enough to be heard only by her, as he admitted that her presence had unsettled him in ways he didn't fully understand, not because she posed a threat, but because she reminded him of the values his family's foundation was built upon. Values he feared he had lost sight of, amidst the relentless pressure of protecting their legacy. Margaret felt warmth rise in her chest, a mixture of humility, disbelief, and something tender that made it difficult to form words. Yet she managed to steady her breath long enough to ask whether his mother was truly safe now. The billionaire nodded, though the uncertainty lingering in his eyes revealed that his reassurance was more hopeful than confident. "We will be," he said quietly, "as long as we remain careful and honest with those who've earned our trust." In that moment, the truth settled over the restaurant like a soft, heavy blanket, revealing not only the family's hidden vulnerability, but also the quiet power of a single act of kindness that had begun unraveling a web of secrecy far larger than Margaret ever intended to touch. And as she stood beside them, the pendant gleaming between them like a silent witness, she sensed that the story had reached a turning point, one that would demand courage, loyalty, and truth from them all. The murmured recognition that spread through the restaurant settled into a tense hush, yet Margaret sensed the atmosphere thickening with a new electric charge, as though everyone present understood instinctively that the shift in power was no longer subtle but absolute. The billionaire stood beside his mother with a steadiness that seemed carved from something deeper than authority, something sharpened by grief, responsibility, and an emerging clarity that left his posture both formidable and profoundly human. His gaze swept once across the dining room, lingering briefly on the faces of those who had mocked his mother earlier, and the quiet severity in his eyes made several diners straighten reflexively, as though bracing for judgment they now knew they deserved. Margaret remained close enough to hear the older woman whisper words of encouragement to her son, though her voice carried a quiet insistence that resonated with a strength far exceeding her fragile appearance. The billionaire nodded slowly, drawing in a breath that expanded his chest with renewed resolve before he stepped away from the table and addressed the restaurant with a calm, controlled intensity that commanded attention more effectively than any raised voice could have achieved. His tone remained steady, yet the quiet conviction threading through each word struck with the precision of a blade revealing truth rather than delivering harm. He began by thanking those who had shown concern for his mother, though his gaze flicked briefly and pointedly toward the few who had done nothing, and he acknowledged Margaret by name, emphasizing that her immediate response had spared his mother from further injury. A soft ripple of discomfort traveled through the room as patrons exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the contrast between Margaret's instinctive compassion and their own inaction. Some lowered their eyes in shame, unable to meet her gaze, while others shifted in their seats as though wishing they could erase the moments that had exposed their indifference so starkly. The billionaire's voice grew firmer as he addressed the table of suits who had mocked the older woman earlier, his eyes narrowing slightly as he articulated the seriousness of their behavior with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. He reminded them that respect was not a courtesy reserved for the powerful but a fundamental expression of decency owed to every person, regardless of age, status, or circumstance. The men stiffened visibly, their earlier arrogance dissolving into pale discomfort as he explained, without raising his voice, that their callousness had not only humiliated his mother, but also betrayed a lack of basic humanity unworthy of the positions they held. When one of the suits attempted a half-hearted apology, the billionaire lifted a hand to silence him, insisting that excuses offered only after exposure carried no weight. He stated calmly that their company held partnerships with several entities connected to his foundation and that he would personally review those agreements, evaluating whether continued collaboration aligned with the values his family stood for. The man's face drained of color, and Margaret felt a jolt of astonishment ripple through her as she realized the billionaire was deliberately using his influence not to intimidate, but to hold others accountable for cruelty masked as casual humor. Yet the billionaire's gaze softened when he turned back toward Margaret, his expression shifting from controlled sternness to something gentler, warmer, and edged with a gratitude so genuine it stole her breath for a moment. He stepped closer with deliberate calm, positioning himself between her and the cluster of diners who had begun whispering nervously, and he spoke in a low, steady voice that carried easily across the room without sounding performative or grandiose. He explained that kindness, true kindness, could not be bought, taught, or demanded, and that Margaret's actions had reminded him of the values his father had instilled in him long before the weight of the foundation altered the course of their lives. Margaret felt her throat tighten as he thanked her again, this time not as the heir to a philanthropic empire, but as a son who had nearly lost the woman who meant more to him than any corporate empire or political negotiation. His words reached her with a sincerity that pierced through the haze of anxiety clouding her mind, and she found herself stepping forward unconsciously, compelled by the quiet resonance of his gratitude rather than the authority he wielded. She tried to respond with equal grace, though her voice faltered slightly, as she told him she merely did what she hoped someone would do for her own mother if fate ever placed them in similar circumstances. The older woman smiled through glistening eyes, her expression radiating both pride and affection, as she watched the exchange unfold with a tenderness that made Margaret's chest ache in unexpected ways. She reached for Margaret's hand again and squeezed it gently, telling her that the world would be far gentler if more people chose to act as she had without hesitation, without calculation, and without regard for social divides that so often dictated behavior in rooms like this one. Margaret felt a warm shiver travel through her as she absorbed the older woman's words, grateful for the rare affirmation that seemed to settle deep within her chest like a healing balm. The manager approached cautiously, attempting to offer compensation or formal apologies, but the billionaire dismissed the gestures with a polite firmness that left no room for negotiation, stating that no transactional gesture could remedy the moral failure displayed earlier. He instructed the manager to focus instead on ensuring that the staff, especially those who demonstrated genuine integrity, were treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. The manager nodded quickly, glancing at Margaret with newfound deference, though she could tell his reaction stemmed more from fear than from any meaningful shift in character. As the billionaire prepared to help his mother stand, he paused and turned once more toward Margaret, his expression settling into a look that conveyed both appreciation and something deeper, something tender, that flickered just beneath the surface. He told her quietly that the Foundation would be in touch with her soon, though he didn't specify why, leaving the implication suspended between them like a delicate thread of possibility woven from gratitude, admiration, and something that felt quietly transformative. The suits remained frozen in their seats, chastened and silent, while the rest of the diners avoided eye contact, recognizing that the justice delivered today had been subtle yet decisive, rooted not in spectacle or punishment, but in a simple acknowledgement of what true humanity looked like when measured against arrogance and indifference. And as the billionaire helped his mother stand with steady hands, Margaret realized that something profound had shifted, not only in the power dynamics of the room, but in the unspoken bond forming between her and a family whose gratitude carried more weight than she could ever have anticipated. In that moment, she understood that redemption was not merely a consequence of public correction, but a quiet, deeply personal reckoning that had unfolded for everyone present, including herself. The billionaire steadied his mother with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the authority he had wielded moments before, yet Margaret sensed a profound shift in the way he moved, as though the storm that had rippled through the room had finally given way to something softer and far more honest. His mother leaned into him with quiet trust, but when her eyes lifted to meet Margaret's from across the short distance, the warmth in her gaze held a depth of gratitude that seemed to settle into Margaret's heart like a soft, reassuring weight. Margaret stepped forward instinctively, ready to offer support if needed, yet careful to maintain the respectful distance expected of her role. Though the older woman Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest, not from pride, but from the profound, humbling realization that a moment as simple as helping someone stand had bridged a gap far greater than class or circumstance could define. As the family prepared to leave, the diners who had once watched with mocking indifference now lowered their heads respectfully, offering quiet apologies or uncertain nods that acknowledged the lesson the moment had carved into the room. Margaret didn't revel in their discomfort, nor did she seek validation from their belated remorse. Instead, she felt a gentle peace settle through her, the kind that accompanies the understanding that true justice often arrives not through punishment, but through unexpected clarity. The billionaire paused at the doorway, turning back toward Margaret with a look that felt heavy with unspoken meaning, gratitude, admiration, and perhaps the early shape of something more delicate forming beneath the surface. He offered one final nod before guiding his mother outside, leaving behind an echo of vulnerability and sincerity that lingered long after the door closed behind them. Margaret exhaled slowly, letting the emotion of the day wash over her as she stood in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the softened rustle of a room forever changed by a single human moment. And as she returned to her duties with steady hands and a lighter heart, she realized that kindness, when offered freely and without expectation, had a way of rewriting stories in ways no one could predict, turning ordinary days into turning points and strangers into unexpected bridges between worlds that rarely touched.